In early 1919, as the guns of the Great War fell silent across Europe, Vietnamese political expectations stirred with a quiet but unmistakable hope. Governor-General Albert Sarraut had spoken during the conflict of a more liberal association between France and Indochina, suggesting that the colony's wartime sacrifice might be rewarded with gradual reform. The end of hostilities coincided with rising nationalist aspirations among educated Vietnamese, who watched the Paris Peace Conference with careful attention, sensing that this gathering of world powers might offer an opportunity to press for political rights within the French Empire. The language of Woodrow Wilson proved particularly compelling. His ideas about self-determination reached Vietnamese elites through French and Vietnamese language newspapers and in the discussion circles that gathered in Indochina's towns after 1918. These reformers interpreted Wilsonian principles primarily as justification for expanded autonomy and civil rights under French protection rather than immediate independence. It was a cautious hope, measured against the realities of colonial power, yet it was hope nonetheless. During the peace negotiations in Paris, Vietnamese activists understood that Allied attention focused mainly on European borders and the redrawing of the continental map. Still, they believed that public opinion might be mobilized to support colonial reforms if their voices could somehow reach the assembled delegates. The moment seemed ripe for petition and persuasion. The war years had created unexpected connections. Approximately 93,000 Indo-Chinese workers and soldiers had traveled to France during the conflict, an exceptional movement of peoples that exposed many Vietnamese to metropolitan political debates, trade unions, and ideas about citizenship and rights that had seemed distant abstractions in Saigon or Hanoi. When these worker soldiers returned home between 1919 and 1921, they brought with them knowledge of French labor politics and expectations of better treatment that would influence post-war demands for wage and social reforms. By 1919, several Vietnamese nationalists known as the Five Dragons were in Paris, coordinating petitions and propaganda that linked Vietnam's claims to broader discussions at Versailles. Among them was a young man who would later become far more famous than any of the others. He had joined the French Socialist Party early that year to gain a platform in metropolitan politics and connect Vietnamese claims to socialist networks. He called himself Nguyen Ai Quoc, and his life was about to change the course of history. On June 18, 1919, under this adopted name, he submitted a document that would echo through the decades. The Revendications du Peuple Annamite, the claims of the Annamite people, was an 8-point petition addressed directly to the Versailles Conference. The demands were precise and carefully considered. The petition called for general amnesty for Vietnamese political prisoners held under French colonial authority. It demanded reform of the Indo-Chinese judicial system so that Vietnamese would enjoy the same legal guarantees as Europeans and the abolition of special political courts. Freedom of the press and freedom of opinion were requested, challenging colonial censorship practices that had long stifled Vietnamese voices. The document also asked for freedom of association and assembly, which would have legalized political organizations and unions restricted by colonial regulations. Equal rights between French and Vietnamese before the law and in local administration formed central themes, alongside a demand for Vietnamese participation through elected representatives in the making of laws and decrees applied in their own land. Freedom of overseas travel and the right to study abroad were included as well, aiming to reduce administrative controls on mobility that kept Vietnamese tethered to their homeland. Nguyen Ai Quoc signed the petition on behalf of the Groupe des Patriotes Annamites, the group of Annamite patriots, indicating collective backing from an expatriate Vietnamese circle. The word Vietnamese itself carried nationalist connotations and was discouraged in official usage, so the petition consistently used the French colonial term Annamite for the subject population. Copies of the 8-point claims were printed and distributed publicly in Paris to attract attention from journalists and delegates at the conference. The young petitioner also sent a covering letter and related communications to United States Secretary of State Robert Lansing, seeking American support for the Vietnamese reform program. The American side acknowledged receipt and indicated the petition would be transmitted to President Wilson, but no substantive reply or action followed. French and Allied negotiators at Versailles did not place the Vietnamese petition on the formal agenda. The lack of official discussion signaled to Vietnamese activists that Wilsonian self-determination would not be applied to colonized peoples like those in Indochina. In Vietnam itself, news of the Versailles process and the 8-point petition circulated through colonial newspapers and political rumor, contributing to rising expectations among educated readers, even as those expectations were being disappointed in Paris. Wartime inflation, driven by higher demand for rice, rubber, and other exports, continued into the immediate post-war years and eroded the purchasing power of urban workers. Demobilized Vietnamese soldiers and workers returning from France often faced unemployment or low wages, adding to economic dissatisfaction in towns and plantations. The colonial administration offered limited land or employment benefits to returnees, which fell short of the broader expectations for social advancement that wartime service had created. In the early 1920s, clusters of former workers from France in provinces such as Thanh Hoa, Nghie, and Ha Tinh became important nuclei for emerging labor activism. These returnees transmitted organizational methods learned in French factories and ports, including collective petitions and strikes, to local workplaces in Indochina. French authorities monitored the circulation of the 8-point petition and related literature, treating them as potentially subversive of colonial order. Rather than endorsing the petition's political demands, the colonial government confined its reforms after 1919 to limited administrative changes and selective concessions in education and local councils. Security services expanded surveillance of known nationalist figures and returned veterans suspected of engaging in political discussion about Wilson, Versailles, or national rights. By 1920, Nguyen Ai Quoc and other Vietnamese activists in France concluded that the Versailles system would not voluntarily extend self-government to colonies. In these years, he increasingly turned toward Lenin's theses on colonial liberation and the Communist International as alternative frameworks for achieving national and social emancipation. Participation in French socialist circles exposed Vietnamese activists to debates over imperialism, which reinforced critiques of the limits of Wilsonian self-determination for non-European peoples. From 1919 to 1923, Vietnamese workers and students in France formed associations that combined cultural activities with discussion of political questions related to Vietnam's status in the post-war world. Within Vietnam, early post-war labor grievances over wages, prices, and working conditions provided a social base for later political organizations, though they were often expressed through economic rather than overtly nationalist claims before 1924. Educated Vietnamese who followed international news noted that other colonized peoples, including in India and Egypt, were also invoking Wilsonian rhetoric, reinforcing a sense of belonging to a wider anti-colonial moment. The Paris Peace Conference's focus on mandates and European frontiers, rather than colonial self-government, contributed to growing skepticism among Vietnamese elites about reliance on great power diplomacy alone. French propaganda emphasized France's role as a civilizing power to counteract the influence of petitions and radical writings associated with Versailles and Moscow. Vietnamese petitions in these years generally framed demands in the language of equality, justice, and loyalty to France, seeking reforms while avoiding explicit calls for full independence. The continued use of loyalist and legalist language reflected the constrained political environment inside Indochina, where censorship and security laws limited open advocacy of national self-determination. The unresponsiveness of French and international authorities to the 1919 claims encouraged some younger Vietnamese activists to reassess gradualist reform strategies. By the time Nguyen Ai Quoc left France in 1923, he was recognized among Vietnamese and some French left-wing circles as a prominent communist advocate of both national liberation and class struggle. The combination of post-war economic strain, unmet reform expectations, and exposure to new ideologies between 1919 and 1923 laid an important foundation for more radical Vietnamese political movements later in the decade. The promises of Versailles had faded like morning mist, and in their absence, new paths were being charted toward a different kind of future. Between early 1919 and mid-1923, Nguyen Ai Quoc lived mainly in France, using Paris as his primary base for political and journalistic activity. The City of Lights became his classroom, his platform, and the crucible in which his revolutionary convictions were forged. In 1919, he organized a group of Vietnamese expatriates in France, often called the Group of Annamite Patriots, to coordinate petitions and propaganda regarding their homeland. That same year, he joined the French Socialist Party, the Section Française de l'Internationale Ouvrière, seeing it as the main legal channel to raise colonial questions in metropolitan politics. He also entered the League of the Rights of Man, connecting his work on Vietnam to broader French civil rights and republican traditions. As a member of the Socialist Party, Nguyen Ai Quoc attended meetings, rallies, and study circles in Paris, where the Russian Revolution and the future of socialism were debated with passionate intensity. The conversations he encountered there would shape his thinking for the rest of his life. In mid-1919, he co-authored and submitted the claims of the Annamite people to the Versailles Peace Conference, linking his Vietnamese activism to the international post-war settlement. His first known major French-language article on Indochina appeared in L'Humanité on the 2nd of August, 1919. In that article, he denounced discriminatory legal and administrative practices in Indochina and contrasted Republican ideals with the realities of colonial rule. The gap between what France professed and what France practiced in its colonies became a recurring theme in his writings. During 1919 and 1920, he wrote and spoke within French socialist circles to urge metropolitan socialists to take concrete positions on colonial oppression, not only on European workers' issues. French police and colonial intelligence began systematically monitoring Nguyen Ai Quoc in Paris during these years, regarding his open criticism of colonial policy as politically dangerous. The surveillance files grew thicker with each passing month. In 1920, he deepened his study of socialist and Marxist literature available in France, including translations of Marx and commentaries circulating in party education networks. Around this time, he encountered Vladimir Lenin's theses on the national and colonial question, which directly addressed the role of colonized peoples in the world revolutionary movement. Reading Lenin's colonial theses helped shift his thinking from reliance on liberal reform to the concept of a proletarian revolution linked with national liberation in colonial countries. The document spoke to him as nothing else had, offering a theoretical framework that placed the struggles of colonized peoples at the center of world history rather than at its margins. At the end of December 1920, he attended the 18th National Congress of the French Socialist Party in Tours as the sole delegate representing Indochinese colonies. At the Tours Congress, he spoke from the floor to denounce French colonial abuses in Indochina and to appeal for solidarity from French workers and socialists with colonized peoples. During the Congress, he voted in favor of the party joining the Communist International, aligning himself with the revolutionary wing. The Tours Congress split the Socialist Party, and Nguyen Ai Quoc joined the faction that formed the French Communist Party at the end of 1920. By becoming one of the founding members of this new party, he completed a formal organizational transition from socialism to communism in the French context. After 1920, he participated in internal Communist Party discussions about how to transform declarations on colonial issues into sustained campaigns among workers and in the press. In a May 1922 article in L'Humanité, he implicitly criticized the Communist Party's limited engagement with colonial questions, calling for an authentic action plan on colonial liberation. He was not content with resolutions that remained mere words on paper. During 1921 and 1922, he worked with the Union Intercolonial, the Intercolonial Union, a Paris-based organization that brought together activists from several French colonies. Within this organization, he collaborated with other anti-colonial militants from North Africa, West Africa, and the Caribbean, creating personal links that extended beyond Vietnamese issues. The colonized of different empires were discovering common cause. In 1922, Nguyen Ai Quoc and comrades in the Union Intercoloniale launched the newspaper Le Paria, the Pariah, in Paris as a tribune for colonized peoples. Le Paria served as a platform to denounce colonial domination and exploitation, and called for solidarity among the oppressed populations of different empires. Between 1922 and roughly 1926, Le Paria produced 38 issues, several of which carried multiple articles signed by Nguyen Ai Quoc in the same number. He used the newspaper to publicize conditions in Vietnam, including forced labor, land expropriation, and repression of dissent, to an audience of French workers and colonial migrants. At the same time, he continued to write for L'Humanité, which became the central organ of the French Communist Party after 1920. His contributions from about 1922 to 1924 included reports on colonial grievances, commentary on French policy, and appeals for linking colonial struggles with metropolitan labor movements. Through these writings, he emerged as one of the most active colonial voices within the French communist press, frequently urging readers to treat colonial liberation as integral to the revolutionary program. French historians of journalism note that his articles in L'Humanité and Le Paria combined detailed empirical description of colonial conditions with arguments drawn from Marxism-Leninism. During his Paris years, he attended demonstrations, May Day rallies, and anti-imperialist meetings where he sometimes spoke on behalf of Vietnamese and other colonial populations. His activism brought him into contact with left-wing intellectuals and trade unionists in France, including figures who were beginning to systematize anti-imperialist positions within the Communist International. Nguyen Ai Quoc's activity in France contributed to debates within the French left by insisting that socialism must oppose colonial exploitation as strongly as it opposed exploitation of European workers. In articles and speeches after the Tours Congress, he argued that earlier socialist internationals had treated colonial issues sentimentally and sporadically, rather than as strategic priorities. He repeatedly called on the French Communist Party to educate its rank-and-file members about colonial realities and to develop concrete campaigns around cases from Indochina and other territories. During 1921 and 1922, police reports described him as a central figure in connecting Vietnamese expatriates in France with radical European networks. His visible profile in the French and colonial press meant that French colonial officials in Indochina followed his activities and sometimes used his writings as justification for tighter surveillance at home. While based in France, he maintained correspondence with Vietnamese and other colonial activists abroad, helping to knit together a small but widening anti-imperialist network. In debates within the French left, he consistently opposed assimilationist colonial policies that promised gradual equality without dismantling colonial hierarchies. His speeches at party meetings often linked specific abuses in Vietnam to general themes about capitalist imperialism, arguing that colonialism was a structural part of the world capitalist system rather than a mere policy that could be reformed away. By 1922, his public profile led some French press and police sources to refer to him as the most prominent Indo-Chinese militant in Paris. During his final period in France, he participated in preparations for broader anti-imperialist initiatives associated with the Comintern, including discussions of future congresses on colonial questions. In June 1923, Nguyen Ai Quoc left France for the Soviet Union to work more directly with the Communist International, marking a shift from primarily French-based activism to a broader international role. Contemporary and later biographies agree that by his departure in 1923, he had moved decisively from a reformist, nationalist position to a communist orientation grounded in Leninist theory and Comintern structures. After arriving in the Soviet Union, he continued to correspond with contacts in France and other European countries, maintaining the networks built during his Paris years while entering a new international phase of his remarkable journey. The networks he had built would prove invaluable in the years to come, providing channels for communication, resources, and the exchange of revolutionary ideas across continents. The young man who had arrived in France years earlier with little more than determination and questions was now leaving with answers and a mission. Paris had given him the tools of analysis and the connections of solidarity. Moscow and the world beyond now awaited. The making of Ho Chi Minh was well underway, though that name would not become known to the wider world for many years to come. For now, he remained Nguyen Ai Quoc, the patriot, carrying the dreams of his homeland toward an uncertain but purposeful future. In late 1923, Nguyen Ai Quoc traveled from France to the Soviet Union, where he began formal work with institutions linked to the Communist International in Moscow. The Russian capital represented the revolutionary center of the world, a place where the theories he had absorbed in Paris could be refined. In 1924, he attended activities of the Communist International, including sessions linked to the Fifth Congress held that year. During his stay in Moscow, he studied Marxism, Leninism, and revolutionary strategy at schools connected with the Comintern, which hosted many cadres from colonial countries seeking to apply communist principles to their own struggles. In October 1923, at the First Congress of the Peasants' International, Nguyen Ai Quoc was elected to its executive committee, reflecting Comintern interest in his colonial experience. While in Moscow, he used pseudonyms in Comintern correspondence and reports, including names such as Nilovsky and later Li III. From Moscow, he sent reports to the Comintern Executive Committee analyzing the political situation in French Indochina and the potential for revolutionary work there. His Comintern reports in 1924 emphasized the importance of organizing youth and workers and warned that existing Vietnamese exile groups lacked political training and mass organizational experience. In these writings, he endorsed the Comintern line that colonial revolutions should be led by communist parties allied with the international proletariat. The theoretical frameworks he had encountered in Paris were now being refined into operational principles. In 1924, the Comintern decided to use Guangzhou, also known as Canton, in southern China as a regional hub for work in East and Southeast Asia, taking advantage of the alliance between the Kuomintang and the Chinese Communist Party, known as the First United Front. On September 25, 1924, the acting general secretary of the Comintern formally assigned Nguyen Ai Quoc to Canton as a liaison to peasant movements in China, Indochina, Siam, Burma, Formosa, and the Philippines. His official cover in Canton was as press attaché and interpreter for Mikhail Borodin, the chief Soviet advisor to Sun Yat-sen's revolutionary government. Nguyen Ai Quoc arrived in Guangzhou under the alias Li Thu in late 1924, entering a city where the Kuomintang and Chinese Communist Party were cooperating within the First United Front. Soon after arriving, he contacted Vietnamese exile groups already present in Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Wuhan, including members of the organization Tam Tam Exa, the Society of Like Hearts. In reports to the Comintern, he described these pre-existing Vietnamese groups in China as politically inexperienced and called for creating a new cadre-based organization that could provide disciplined leadership. Between late 1924 and early 1925, he worked with selected members of Tam Tam Ax-T to form a secret communist youth corps, the Thon Ninh Kong Sandon, as a core group of trusted militants. This communist youth corps was designed as an inner, strictly controlled group that would provide leadership for a broader revolutionary organization. On June 21, 1925, in Guangzhou, Nguyen Ai Quoc and colleagues formally established the Vietnamese Revolutionary Youth League, the Vietnam Thanh Nhan, Cash Mang, Dong Chi Hoi, commonly called Thanh Nhan. The headquarters were located in a rented three-story house at 13 Wen Ming Street, which functioned as its central office. The Youth League is widely regarded as the first fully Marxist organization created for Vietnamese revolutionaries and the starting point of organized Vietnamese communism. The League's program combined national liberation from French rule with social revolution, inspired by Marxism-Leninism. From 1925 onward, the Guangzhou headquarters coordinated clandestine activities in Vietnam, including the dispatch of trained cadres and propaganda materials. Nguyen Ai Quoc organized political training courses for young Vietnamese activists who traveled from Tonkin, Annam, and Cochin China to attend. Training sessions covered Marxist theory, the strategy of alliance between workers and peasants, and methods of underground organization. Some trainees also received rudimentary military training, taking advantage of facilities created by the Kuomintang alliance with Soviet advisors. The League published a journal titled Thanh Ninh, meaning youth, edited under Nguyen Ai Quoc's guidance to spread Marxist ideas among Vietnamese readers. Copies of Thanh Nhan were clandestinely smuggled into Vietnam through coastal and land routes, where they circulated among students, workers, and small circles of intellectuals. Through Thanh Nhan and other materials, Nguyen Ai Quoc propagated the Comintern view that a Vietnamese revolution should progress through a national democratic stage linked to broader anti-imperialist struggle. In Guangzhou, he also cooperated with Chinese communists who helped provide logistics and training spaces. The political context of Guangzhou in 1924 and 1925, including the strengthening of the revolutionary government and Whampoa Military Academy, created favorable conditions for organizing. From Guangzhou, he transmitted regular reports to the Comintern on Vietnamese cadre training and the development of revolutionary networks inside Indochina. He emphasized in Comintern communications that the Vietnamese revolutionary movement needed a disciplined party rooted among workers and peasants rather than small conspiratorial groups. In 1925, his role in founding the Vietnamese Revolutionary Youth League was recognized in Moscow as a significant step toward creating a communist party in Indochina. The League's recruitment expanded particularly after 1926, when events in Vietnam, including the death of the reformist leader Phan Chau Trinh and the arrest of activist Nguyen An Ninh, heightened political discontent. By March 1927, the Youth League had brought multiple waves of Vietnamese trainees to Guangzhou, with the fourth cohort arriving just as the political situation in China grew more unstable. On April 12, 1927, Chiang Kai-shek's forces launched a violent anti-communist campaign in Shanghai, which quickly spread to other cities and disrupted both Chinese Communist Party and Comintern operations. The repression of communists in 1927 forced the closure of many League activities in Guangzhou, and Nguyen Ai Quoc's training work there came to an abrupt halt. In June 1927, facing growing risk, he left Guangzhou for the Soviet Union via Moscow and then Western Europe, temporarily interrupting direct oversight of the League. After the crackdown, the Youth League moved its central operations from Guangzhou first to Wuhan and later to Hong Kong to continue coordination with Vietnamese cells. Despite the move, League branches in Vietnam continued to receive instructions influenced by Nguyen Ai Quoc's earlier directives and by Comintern guidelines. In 1928, he returned to Asia on Comintern work, traveling through locations such as Berlin, Brussels, and Italy before re-establishing contact with networks in the region. During this period, Comintern policy encouraged the transformation of revolutionary youth organizations into full communist parties in colonial and semi-colonial countries. Influenced by this line, Vietnamese cadres trained in Guangzhou pushed for the creation of explicitly communist organizations within Vietnam in 1928 and 1929. In 1929, League members in Tonkin formed the Dong Duong Cong Sandang, the Indo-Chinese Communist Party in Hanoi, the first use of that name for a regional group. That same year, other Vietnamese communists established the An Nam Cong Sandang, the Annamese Communist Party, illustrating fragmentation among radical groups. A third organization, the Dong Duong Cong San Lin Don, the Indo-Chinese Communist League, also emerged from League networks during 1929. The proliferation of separate communist groups in Vietnam created organizational rivalry that concerned the Comintern, which preferred unified parties in each country. To resolve these divisions, the Comintern authorized Nguyen Ai Quoc to convene a unification conference of Vietnamese communist organizations in early 1930. Acting under this mandate, he traveled to Hong Kong and used it as a relatively secure location for negotiations among Vietnamese communist representatives. From his Comintern perspective, he argued that a single party in Indochina was necessary for effective leadership of both anti-imperialist struggle and class-based movements. On February 3, 1930, in Kowloon, Nguyen Ai Quoc chaired a conference that merged the existing Vietnamese communist organizations into one party. The new party was initially called the Communist Party of Vietnam, the Dang Cong San Vietnam, reflecting the national focus of the movement. At the founding conference, delegates adopted a brief political platform and brief policy drafted by Nguyen Ai Quoc, setting out principles for revolution in Vietnam under Comintern guidance. The adopted documents stressed the alliance of workers and peasants, the struggle against imperialism and feudalism, and the goal of a workers' and peasants' government. The Comintern soon requested that the new party adopt the name Indo-Chinese Communist Party to reflect its intended responsibility for Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. By February 1930, through his work in Moscow, Guangzhou, and Hong Kong, Nguyen Ai Quoc had played a central role in linking Comintern strategy with the emergence of a unified Vietnamese Communist Party structure. In the mid-1920s, non-communist nationalist currents in Vietnam drew on earlier reformist and anti-colonial traditions while reacting to new social changes in urban centers like Hanoi and Haiphong. The cities were growing, and with them grew a restless class of educated young Vietnamese who found themselves caught between traditional expectations and colonial constraints. In late 1925, young Hanoi-based intellectuals, including teacher Pham Tuan Thai and his brother Pham Tuan Lam, founded the Nam Dong Thu Kisa, the Southeast Asia Publishing House. This organization aimed to promote revolution against French colonial rule through publishing activities rather than through a legal political party. The publishing house produced books and brochures about Sun Yat-sen and the 1911 Chinese Revolution to popularize the model of a Republican nationalist uprising. The success of the Chinese nationalists in overthrowing the Qing dynasty offered an inspiring template for young Vietnamese who dreamed of a similar transformation in their own country. Nam Dong Thu Sai also opened a free school to teach Chu Quoc Ngu, the Latin-based Vietnamese script, to workers and commoners, combining literacy work with nationalist education. The ability to read opened doors to new ideas, and new ideas were precisely what these young activists wished to spread. French censorship and police harassment in the mid-1920s increasingly disrupted Nam Dong Thu Sai's publishing operations and contributed to the decision of its core activists to organize a clandestine party. On December 25, 1927, the Viet Nam Quoc Dan Dang, the Vietnamese Nationalist Party, commonly known by its initials VNQDD, was formally founded at a meeting in Hanoi, with Nguyen Thai Hoc as its first leader. The VNQDD is widely described as Vietnam's first large-scale, homegrown revolutionary nationalist party, predating the unified Communist Party that would form in 1930. Early VNQDV founders and leaders such as Nguyen Thai Hoc came largely from lower middle and modestly educated backgrounds, including teaching and clerical occupations rather than the high Mandarin elite. These were not the sons of wealthy landowners or court officials, but young men who had worked hard for modest positions and found those positions offered little security and less dignity under colonial rule. The party consciously modeled itself on the Chinese Kuomintang, adopting Sun Yat-sen's Three People's Principles as ideological reference for national revolution. Ideologically, the VNQDD advocated a republican and democratic system and opposed foreign domination, calling for Vietnamese independence from French rule. The party proclaimed democratic socialism as a goal, though its internal discussions showed variation and debate over what social and economic reforms this implied in practice. Early VNQDD membership drew heavily from young urban northerners, especially teachers, students, clerks, minor merchants, and low-level bureaucrats. Landlords and wealthier peasants also joined the VNQDD, but few members came from the traditional scholar gentry Mandarin class. The party's sociological profile meant that many VNQDD members had close contact with the urban and semi-urban poor through schools, offices, and small commercial activities. They knew the grievances of ordinary people because they shared many of those grievances themselves. VNQDE organizers developed clandestine cell structures, with small groups linked in a network to reduce the risk posed by police infiltration. In the late 1920s, VNQDD cadres sought to recruit in French colonial army units stationed in Tonkin and Annam, with particular emphasis on sergeants and rank-and-file soldiers. The party established secret committees in garrisons such as Yen Bai to prepare the ground for potential military participation in future uprisings. Vietnamese soldiers serving the colonial power might yet become instruments of its overthrow. To spread its ideas, the VNQDD circulated pamphlets, manifestos, and hand-copied documents, often explaining Sun Yat-sen's thought and criticizing French rule. VNQD activists used small study circles and discussion groups in Hanoi and provincial towns to introduce nationalist literature and debate revolutionary strategies. The party's early activities also included organizing commemorations and symbolic gatherings that honored earlier nationalist figures and revolutions in Asia. VNQD propaganda highlighted grievances about racial inequalities under French rule, including legal discrimination and barriers to higher education and administrative careers that frustrated ambitious young Vietnamese. French intelligence reports observed that many VNQDD members worked within the colonial bureaucracy, giving the party access to administrative information and networks that proved useful for clandestine organizing. By 1928, the VNQDD's growing profile prompted closer surveillance by the Sûreté and other security services in Hanoi and surrounding areas. French authorities noted that the VNQDD competed with communist and other nationalist groups for influence among the small educated urban class. Sources report that around the late 1920s, roughly half of identified communists in Vietnam came from bourgeois backgrounds, while VNQDD membership was often described as more lower class in origin, a subtle but meaningful distinction in the social composition of anti-colonial movements. Rivalry between VNQDD and emerging communist organizations intensified in northern Vietnam as both sought to recruit students, clerks, and young officers. Some local activists alternated between contact with VNQDD circles and communist cells before committing to one organization, illustrating the fluid boundaries of radicalism in this period. From 1928 onward, VNQDD leaders became increasingly frustrated with the lack of legal or constitutional channels for political participation under French rule. Every petition was ignored, every moderate request dismissed. Under increasing repression, the party shifted emphasis from gradual organizing toward planning armed action as the principal means to expel the French. In the late 1920s, VNQDD cadres created special action units, later described as death squads, tasked with targeted attacks on officials and collaborators considered particularly abusive. Such violent actions prompted stronger French crackdowns, which damaged some VNQDD regional structures but also raised the party's profile among certain nationalist circles who admired direct action against the colonizers. By late 1929, French colonial intelligence considered VNQDD a major threat in Tonkin, leading to broad arrests and investigations of suspected members. The security services worked methodically, compiling lists of names and addresses, mapping the connections between cells, and preparing for a comprehensive crackdown. Internal divisions also emerged in the VNQDD around 1929 over strategy, leadership, and responses to French repression. Some argued for patience and continued preparation, while others insisted that further delay would only allow the French to destroy the organization piece by piece. Despite these strains, the party leadership around Nguyen Thai Hoc decided to organize a large-scale uprising centered on military garrisons in early 1930. The moment for caution had passed, they believed. It was time to act, whatever the cost might prove to be. A VNQDD manifesto released in February 1930 appealed strongly to resentment against racial inequality and economic exploitation under colonial capitalism. The manifesto denounced French restrictions on Vietnamese education, political discussion, and association, framing these as violations of basic rights. It called on the population to rise up against colonization and highlighted abuses associated with French enterprises and their labor policies. In preparation for insurrection, VNQDD members stockpiled locally made weapons and coordinated plans for simultaneous actions in several northern locations. French surveillance before the open revolt recorded increased clandestine movement of suspected VNQDD activists near railway lines and garrisons in Tonkin. The Yen Bai garrison, one of VNQDD's strongest military penetration points, became central to the uprising plan because of its concentration of Vietnamese soldiers serving under French officers. French intelligence, alerted by informers and prior investigations, was aware by early 1930 that a major VNQDD-linked plot involving troops at Yen Bai was likely. The VNQDD's decision to attempt a general uprising in February 1930 coincided with the period when Vietnamese communists under Nguyen Ay Quoc's guidance were finalizing the creation of a unified communist party. This temporal overlap meant that two different anti-colonial strategies reached critical points at roughly the same time. Non-communist, nationalist insurrection and Comintern-linked communist organizing would both be tested in the months ahead. After the Yen Bai mutiny of February 9th to 10th, 1930 was suppressed, colonial repression severely weakened the VNQDD, and many surviving members later entered exile or gravitated toward communist organizations. The Nationalist Party that had dreamed of becoming Vietnam's Kuomintang would never recover its earlier momentum. A different kind of revolutionary movement was about to take its place at the center of Vietnamese resistance to colonial rule, one that would prove more patient and ultimately more successful. In January 1930, the VNQDD leadership considered itself under intense pressure from French surveillance and believed that delay would lead to further arrests and organizational collapse. The net was closing, and the party's leaders knew they had to act before it was too late. A final VNQDD planning meeting for an uprising took place on January 28, 1930, in the village of Vong La in Phu Tho Province. At this meeting, party leader Nguyen Thai Hoc argued that although the chances of success were limited, the VNQDD had to attempt a general uprising rather than continue to retreat. Better to fight and lose, he reasoned, than to be destroyed without ever having made the attempt. The VNQDD plan envisioned a coordinated revolt by Vietnamese colonial troops and civilian activists at several northern garrisons, with Yen Bai as a central point. The Yen Bai garrison, located on the railway line in northern Tonkin, housed elements of the 4th Regiment of Tonkinese Rifles, composed of Vietnamese rank and file under French officers. Party organizers had spent months infiltrating the Yen Bai unit, recruiting soldiers sympathetic to nationalist goals with patient persuasion and appeals to patriotism. The uprising was timed for the night of February 9th to 10th, 1930, with the expectation that surprise and coordination might galvanize broader unrest across the region. Around 1:30 in the morning on February 10th, 1930, approximately 50 Vietnamese soldiers of the 4th Regiment at Yen Bai initiated the mutiny inside the garrison. The mutinous soldiers were supported by an estimated 60 civilian VNQDD activists who entered or approached the post to assist the attack. The rebels' objectives included neutralizing French officers at Yen Bai, seizing weapons, and signaling a wider anti-colonial rising that would spread like fire through dry grass. Simultaneous or near-simultaneous actions were planned at other locations, including Sun Tay, Lam Thao, and some civilian centers, but many of these did not fully materialize. Some planned uprisings in other garrisons failed to occur because of confusion, poor communication, or advance French countermeasures. The coordination that had seemed possible on paper proved far more difficult in the chaos of actual revolt. French military units near Yen Bai responded quickly, and by the morning of February 10th, the mutiny at the garrison was effectively suppressed. The limited scale of participation and rapid containment meant that the envisioned nationwide uprising did not spread beyond a few scattered actions. What was meant to be the spark of revolution became instead an isolated incident, tragic in its bravery and futile in its outcome. Following the mutiny, French colonial authorities launched large-scale arrests of suspected VNQDD members in Yen Bai, Hanoi, and other northern localities. Between February and April 1930, several thousand people were detained in connection with the Yen Bai events and associated VNQDD networks. The dragnet swept up not only actual conspirators, but also anyone suspected of sympathy or connection with the nationalist cause. The Governor-General of Indochina created a special criminal commission of Tonkin on February 12, 1930, to conduct trials related to the uprising. The establishment of this special court signaled the seriousness with which French authorities viewed the challenge to their rule. The Criminal Commission, presided over by Magistrate Jules Bride, convened 5 times in 4 different locations during 1930 to handle Yen Bai-related cases. The proceedings were conducted with a mixture of legal formality and predetermined outcomes, as the colonial administration sought both to punish the rebels and to demonstrate that French justice remained in control. In total, the Criminal Commission prosecuted 547 individuals, including both soldiers and civilians, for participation in or connection with the mutiny. Of those tried, 80 defendants received death sentences, 102 were sentenced to life at forced labor, and 243 were condemned to deportation to distant territories far from their homeland. The scale of punishment was designed to serve as a warning to any who might contemplate similar acts of defiance. The Commission also issued 37 sentences of 20 years of forced labor, several shorter forced labor terms, and a small number of long-term detention sentences. After review by French authorities, some death sentences were commuted, reducing the number of executions carried out, though the reprieve came too late for many who had already spent months in uncertain agony awaiting their fate. Nguyen Thai Hoc and other senior VNQD leaders were captured in the weeks after the mutiny as they attempted to regroup or leave the area. French courts treated VNQDD leaders as the primary organizers of the insurrection, assigning them principal responsibility for the planning and timing of the attack. On June 17, 1930, 13 condemned VNQDD members, including Nguyen Thai Hoc and Nguyen Coch Nu, known as Chin, were executed following the denial of clemency. They met their deaths with dignity, having chosen to fight rather than submit, even knowing the odds against them. French clemency policy in these cases tended to be stricter toward those directly involved in killing officers or soldiers, and somewhat more lenient toward others with lesser roles. Many other convicted participants received long prison terms in facilities in Indochina, including the penal colony on Pulo Condor, the island prison that had become a symbol of colonial repression. Some prisoners associated with the VNQDD uprising were later transferred to other French possessions such as New Caledonia and French Guiana for long-term detention and labor, exiled to the far corners of the French Empire. The repression that followed Yen Bai extended beyond those directly involved, affecting broader circles of suspected sympathizers and local supporters. In areas heavily affected by arrests, some villagers sought to mitigate punishment by seeking assistance from Catholic clergy, contributing to a rise in Catholic conversions in parts of Phu Tho province. The crackdown included tighter controls on associations, with village-level societies and cultural groups sometimes dissolved on suspicion of political activity, regardless of whether they had any actual connection to the uprising. French authorities also reacted by tightening surveillance of the colonial army, aiming to prevent future political infiltration of Vietnamese units. Military reforms after the mutiny reduced the proportion of Vietnamese soldiers stationed close to each other in sensitive locations and increased the share of non-Vietnamese troops in some units. The reforms also promoted closer cooperation between civil and military authorities in intelligence gathering regarding nationalist activities. The French were determined that Yen Bai would never be repeated. The dismantling of VNQDD networks after 1930 effectively removed the party as a major organized force within Vietnam for the next several years. The organization that had once seemed poised to lead Vietnam toward independence was scattered to the winds. Many surviving VNQDD members either went underground, fled to southern China, or formed small exile factions with limited influence inside Indochina. Those who remained in Vietnam faced constant surveillance and the threat of arrest, making any attempt at reorganization extraordinarily dangerous. The Yen Bai defeat weakened the prestige of armed insurrection, led by non-communist nationalists, creating space for communist groups to expand influence in the vacuum left behind. Contemporary communist sources interpreted the VNQDD uprising as heroic but poorly prepared, using it as a negative example to argue for more disciplined party leadership and mass organization. The communists studied what had gone wrong and resolved to learn from those failures. The coincidence in timing between the Yen Bai mutiny in February 1930 and the formation of the Communist Party of Vietnam that same month shaped later historical interpretations, as if history itself were marking the transition from one kind of resistance to another. Some historians argue that the suppression of VNQDD at Yen Bai allowed the Communist Party to emerge as the principal organized anti-colonial movement in Vietnam during the 1930s. The events of 1930 and 1931, including Yen Bai and subsequent communist-led uprisings such as the Anh 18 movement, marked a shift from fragmented nationalist actions toward more ideologically structured resistance. Within French administrative circles, the Yen Bai mutiny reinforced perceptions that even partially indigenized military units could become vehicles for nationalist revolt, a lesson that would inform colonial policy for years to come. The harsh judicial response to Yen Bai became a reference point in later debates about colonial security policy and the limits of reform in French Indochina. In Vietnamese nationalist memory, the Yen Bai uprising later acquired symbolic significance as an early armed attempt by a modern political party to challenge French rule, despite its rapid defeat. The destruction of VNQDD's organizational infrastructure between 1930 and 1931 contributed to the decline of non-communist nationalist parties inside Vietnam for several years thereafter. The nationalist dream had not died, but its standard-bearers had been scattered and silenced. The names of Nguyen Thai Hoc and his comrades would be remembered long after the French Empire itself had crumbled, honored as martyrs who had dared to strike the first blow even when victory remained impossibly distant. From January 6th to February 7th, 1930, Nguyen Ai Quoc chaired a unification conference of Vietnamese communist organizations in Kowloon, the densely populated district of Hong Kong that offered relative safety from French colonial police. Delegates at this Kowloon meeting represented three main organizations that had emerged from the fragmenting revolutionary movement: the Dong Duong Kong Sandang, the Nam Kong Sandang, and elements of the Dong Duong Kong San Lin Don. The conference agreed to merge these groups into a single party, initially named the Communist Party of Vietnam, the Dang Kong San Vietnam. Nguyen Ai Quoc drafted the brief political platform and brief policy adopted at the founding meeting, setting out strategic goals for the new party. The founding documents emphasized overthrowing French imperialism, Vietnamese feudalism, and what the platform called the reactionary bourgeoisie. The platform called for making Indochina completely independent and establishing a worker-peasant-soldier government. It proposed confiscating banks and enterprises owned by imperialists and placing them under the control of the revolutionary government. The documents also advocated confiscating plantations and property belonging to imperialists and reactionary Vietnamese bourgeoisie to distribute land to poor peasants. The platform included demands for an 8-hour working day for laborers in Indochina, a reform that would bring colonial workers into alignment with the standards already won by workers in more developed industrial nations. It called for abolition of the poll tax, compulsory bond purchases, and other unjust taxes affecting poor people who could least afford such burdens. The program demanded democratic freedoms, including rights of association, press, and assembly, along with expanded education for the population. The party identified itself as a Marxist-Leninist vanguard of the working class, tasked with leading a broader alliance of workers, peasants, and other oppressed groups toward revolution. Soon after its founding, and under Comintern influence, the party name was adjusted to Indochinese Communist Party, the ICP, to reflect responsibility for Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia as a single revolutionary theater. In early 1930, the ICP began sending directives into Vietnam, focusing on organizing workers in major urban centers and peasants in key rural regions. The party's initial leaflets and appeals described the international context of crisis and highlighted French colonial taxation, land concentration, and labor conditions. Nay An and Ha Tin, collectively known as NJ18, were identified by party organizers as promising areas because of dense poor peasantry, prior agitation, and returning migrant workers who had been exposed to radical ideas in France. In early 1930, local ICP nuclei formed in Vinh Ben Thuy and rural Inge Tin, often emerging from earlier Tan Nien networks and strike committees. Economic grievances in Hen included heavy land rents, tax burdens, and exposure to price fluctuations that worsened conditions for smallholders and tenants. State monopolies on salt, alcohol, and other goods, combined with new levies, were frequent targets of criticism in local petitions and ICP propaganda. The onset of the world economic crisis in 1929 and 1930 further depressed export prices and contributed to rural hardship and wage pressures in Indochina. In the spring and summer of 1930, workers in Vinh Ben Thuy staged strikes demanding higher wages, reduced working hours, and better treatment. ICP activists helped coordinate some of these early strikes, linking workplace issues to broader calls for political change. On May 1st, 1930, ICP organizations in E18 used International Workers' Day as an occasion for coordinated demonstrations. May Day protests in Vinh attracted thousands of participants who chanted slogans attacking taxes, forced labor, and imperialism. Colonial police and troops intervened to disperse these gatherings, resulting in casualties and arrests, which further angered local populations and strengthened the resolve of those who remained. Following the May events, the ICP Central Committee issued a June 1930 circular encouraging continued agitation and the formation of mass organizations. During mid-1930, peasant demonstrations spread in Chin, sometimes beginning as tax protests and evolving into more political marches. Demonstrators often targeted district and communal offices, demanding reductions in taxes, abolition of certain levies, and punishment of abusive officials who had made themselves hated through years of petty tyranny. Local village notables in some areas refused to suppress protests and occasionally joined them, weakening the authority of the colonial-backed administration. In several districts, village officials fled as crowds approached, leaving local administration temporarily vacant. ICP cadres used these power vacuums to help establish village-level Soviets or peasant committees that took over certain functions of governance. These Inyetin Soviets typically organized distribution of communal land, supervision of local security, and partial control over grain stocks and markets. Local Soviet bodies also attempted to reduce or suspend collection of certain taxes and fees, directing resources to poor households. In some villages, Soviet committees introduced literacy classes, political meetings, and collective workdays as part of their activities. The ICP Central Committee sent letters in late 1930 analyzing the AG teen movement and urging consolidation of Soviets while warning against premature confrontations beyond local capacities. By late summer 1930, French authorities recognized that administrative control in parts of Nghe and Ha Tin had eroded significantly. The realization came as a shock to colonial administrators who had believed their system of surveillance and control to be unassailable. The colonial administration responded by deploying additional troops, including Foreign Legion units and mobile gendarmerie detachments, to the affected districts. These hardened soldiers had no sentimental attachment to the local population and could be relied upon to carry out orders without hesitation. In September 1930, French forces used aircraft and ground units to break up large peasant processions headed toward district and provincial centers. The sight of warplanes in the sky above rice paddies marked a new and terrifying phase in the conflict. These operations combined roadblocks, arrests, and the use of heavy weapons from the air and ground to disperse demonstrators who had no means to defend themselves against such overwhelming force. A state of emergency and martial law were declared over much of Nha Tin, formalizing extraordinary security measures. The authorities established a dense network of military posts and guard stations across the two provinces to restrict movement and reassert control. Police personnel were reinforced by experienced secret police officers brought from other regions. The colonial administration expanded and reorganized prisons in Vinh and Ha Tin to manage the rising number of detainees. Identification systems, including more systematic issuance of identity cards and dossiers, were implemented to monitor rural populations in contested areas. Official propaganda efforts accompanied repression, using newspapers, public notices and orchestrated ceremonies to discourage support for Soviets and communists. Between late 1930 and early 1932, thousands of people were arrested in EAG-18 on charges related to demonstrations, Soviet activity, or communist affiliation. By early 1931, combined military and police measures had significantly weakened the Soviet structures in lowland districts, though some upland and remote areas remained restive longer. Trials of alleged communist leaders and Soviet participants were held in provincial and special courts, issuing sentences ranging from imprisonment to deportation and capital punishment. ICP cadres captured in Indochina, including local leaders and cell organizers, faced long prison terms that removed many experienced activists from the field. The repression in Indochina was part of a wider crackdown on the ICP across Indochina, targeting urban cells and rural networks alike. In spite of the severe losses, the ICP leadership later portrayed the Indochina Soviets as an early high point of mass worker-peasant alliance in Vietnam. The experience of organizing Soviets provided the party with practical lessons about mass mobilization, local governance under insurrectionary conditions, and relations with village notables. For French authorities, the Indochina movement underscored the capacity of small clandestine communist organizations to catalyze large-scale rural protest under conditions of economic stress. The combined impact of the ICP's formation and the Indochina Soviets established communism as a central force in Vietnamese anti-colonial politics by the early 1930s. What had begun as small study circles and clandestine cells had demonstrated the capacity to shake the foundations of colonial rule. The party had been born in blood and fire, and though it had suffered terrible losses, it had also demonstrated that it could mobilize the masses in ways that no previous movement had achieved. The lessons learned in Indochina would inform communist strategy for decades to come. After the Indochina Soviets were suppressed in 1931, French authorities treated the Indo-Chinese Communist Party as the main internal security threat in Indochina. The colonial administration had been shaken by the scale and intensity of the rural uprisings, and they were determined to ensure that such a challenge would never arise again. In early 1931, the Sûreté Générale in Hanoi coordinated a colony-wide campaign to identify, arrest, and dismantle ICP networks wherever they could be found. The Sûreté Générale, headquartered in Hanoi, oversaw political policing in all of Indochina, working with provincial sûreté branches and ordinary police in a coordinated effort to root out subversion. Political police operations combined surveillance of meetings, interception of correspondence, and use of informants in workplaces and villages. The 1931 crackdown followed a centralized plan to neutralize ICP leadership across Tonkin, Annam, Cochinchina, Laos, and Cambodia simultaneously, striking at every known center of communist activity before the organization could recover from its losses. In June 1931, Nguyen Ai Quoc was arrested in Hong Kong by British authorities under pressure generated in part by French intelligence reports. The arrest in Hong Kong removed the ICP's principal external coordinator at a moment when many internal leaders were already detained in Indochina, leaving the party temporarily leaderless and disoriented. French security services considered urban centers such as Hanoi, Haiphong, Vinh, and Saigon Cholon priority zones for anti-communist policing. From 1931 to 1933, large numbers of suspected communists were arrested in Saigon Cholon and sent to the central prison known as Maison Centrale, later called Ho Lo by Vietnamese, a name that would become infamous in later decades. Political detainees were often held under emergency regulations, allowing extended detention before or without formal trial. A series of grand trials of communists and alleged sympathizers took place in 1931 and 1932 in Hanoi, Vinh, and Saigon, each involving dozens or hundreds of defendants who were brought before courts that had already determined their guilt. Charges in these trials included membership in an illegal communist organization, distribution of banned literature, and participation in strikes or demonstrations. The courtrooms became theaters of colonial authority, where the French displayed their power to punish those who had dared to challenge the established order. Sentencing patterns typically combined a small number of death sentences with larger numbers of long prison and hard labor terms. Families of the accused watched in anguish as their sons and daughters, husbands and wives were led away to fates they could only imagine. Many of those condemned for ICP-related activities were sent to remote penal colonies rather than kept in mainland jails. The logic was simple. Distance would ensure isolation, and isolation would ensure impotence. The most notorious colonial penal colony was Pulo Condor, the island prison off the southern coast of Vietnam that had been established in 1862 and used continuously through the 1930s. By design, Pulo Condor's island location and distance from major ports made escape and contact with the mainland difficult, ensuring that prisoners sent there were effectively removed from political life for as long as they remained behind its walls. In the early 1930s, Pulo Condor typically held around 1,500 prisoners, with numbers surging after major waves of political arrests. Political prisoners at Pulo Condor were housed alongside common law offenders, though in some blocks they formed distinct sections where their shared ideology created bonds of solidarity. Overcrowding at Pulo Condor intensified after the 1931 and 1932 trials as prisons on the mainland sent large contingents of communist and nationalist detainees to the island. French reports noted that Pulo Condor had become a red university where political prisoners exchanged ideas and organized discussion circles despite the harsh conditions of confinement. Communist Party structures inside Pulo Condor assigned responsibilities for education, discipline, and mutual aid among imprisoned members. Prison experience fostered solidarity among ICP cadres from different regions, contributing to later cohesion in leadership networks when these men were eventually released. Long-term confinement also allowed seasoned activists to train younger militants, sometimes introducing them to Marxist theory for the first time. The colonial prisons thus inadvertently became schools of revolution, producing graduates who emerged more committed and better educated than when they entered. Beyond Pulo Condor, political prisoners were also sent to other carceral sites such as mainland penal camps, forced labor sites, and smaller island prisons. In the early 1930s, Con Dao prison installations included multiple banyas or camps such as Phu Hai, Phu Sun, and Phu Tho, each comprising large cell blocks and punishment areas. Hanoi's Maison Centrale served as the major northern prison for political detainees, including many ICP members arrested after the NG-18 movement. Indo-Chinese prisons used classification systems distinguishing political prisoners from common offenders, although the lines could be blurred for legal purposes. Officially, colonial authorities presented harsh sentencing as necessary to restore public order after the unrest of 1930 and 1931. According to French data summarized by later historians, roughly 8,000 people were condemned in major political trials in 1931 alone across Indochina, an extraordinary number that testified to the scale of the movement that had been suppressed. The volume of prisoners sentenced for political offenses contributed to chronic overcrowding in both mainland and island facilities during the early 1930s. Security regulations during this period restricted movement between villages, imposed curfews in some areas, and tightened controls over travel documents. Provincial administrators and surety officers received expanded authority to conduct searches, detain suspects, and ban meetings viewed as politically sensitive. The ICP's organizational capacity inside Vietnam was severely reduced by 1932, with many central and regional leaders either imprisoned, executed, or in exile. Surviving ICP members were forced to adopt more cautious clandestine methods, relying on smaller cells and stricter compartmentalization to protect their networks from further infiltration. The mass arrests contributed to the emergence of new exile communities of Vietnamese activists in southern China, Siam, and other neighboring territories. These exiles carried the revolution with them across borders, keeping alive the networks and ideas that could not survive openly inside Vietnam. Exiled communists and nationalists used border towns and overseas Chinese communities as bases for continued organizational work and propaganda, maintaining the flame of revolution even when it could not be openly kindled inside Vietnam itself. From these distant outposts, they watched and waited for the moment when they could return to continue the struggle. Imprisonment of VN Cu Di and other non-communist activists following Yen Bai and subsequent repression further weakened non-communist nationalist networks inside Vietnam. The colonial prisons held men of many different political persuasions, and the tensions of the outside world often followed them behind bars. In some prisons, tensions developed between communist and non-communist political detainees, shaping later rivalries after release and creating divisions that would persist for generations. Party directives treated detention sites as potential arenas of struggle, instructing prisoners to maintain discipline, recruit new members, and preserve organizational structures even behind bars. French authorities periodically rotated prisoners among facilities in an attempt to disrupt political organizing inside prisons, but these measures proved only partially effective against determined revolutionaries. The early 1930s also saw the use of exile within Indochina, with some activists banished to remote highland areas under administrative order rather than criminal judgment. Administrative exile orders allowed colonial officials to remove individuals deemed dangerous without full judicial proceedings, a convenient tool for dealing with troublemakers who could not easily be convicted in court. These combined strategies of trials, imprisonment, transportation to penal colonies, and administrative exile sought to decapitate both ICP and nationalist leadership cadres. Despite these measures, prison and exile networks later provided crucial personal links among activists from different regions and social backgrounds. Men who had suffered together in the same cells often developed bonds of trust that would prove invaluable in later years. By 1935, the ICP had begun to rebuild from this low point, drawing heavily on leaders who had survived imprisonment or exile and maintained clandestine contacts. The experience of repression and prison in 1931 to 1935 became a central reference in later communist narratives about sacrifice, discipline, and organizational continuity. Those who had endured the worst that colonial repression could inflict emerged as the hardened core of a movement that would one day triumph. Between 1929 and 1933, Vietnam's export-oriented colonial economy was strongly affected by the global Great Depression that had begun with the crash on Wall Street and spread like a contagion across the interconnected economies of the world. Rice and rubber were Vietnam's two largest export commodities, and both experienced steep price declines in the early 1930s that devastated producers and traders alike. One estimate suggests that between 1925 and 1935, the world price of Vietnamese rice fell by about 72%. Over the same decade, the world price of Vietnamese rubber reportedly dropped by about 92%, severely reducing plantation revenues and throwing workers out of their jobs. Falling commodity prices sharply cut the value of Indochina's exports, reducing colonial state revenues derived from trade taxes. The colonial administration found itself facing budget shortfalls just as the demands on its resources were increasing. The decline in export earnings led plantation owners and commercial firms to cut costs through wage reductions and layoffs. In Cochincina's rubber plantations, employers reduced daily wages and sometimes shifted to payment partly in kind, worsening workers' purchasing power and leaving families struggling to afford even basic necessities. Urban sectors, including dock work, transport, and construction, also experienced rising unemployment as trade volumes fell. Colonial statistics and later studies indicate that unemployment and underemployment rose significantly in Saigon Ceylon during 1930 to 1933. The streets that had once bustled with commercial activity grew quieter as businesses closed and workers found themselves with nothing to do but wait for better times that seemed impossibly distant. For peasants, lower rice prices reduced income from marketed surplus, while land taxes and other levies remained at pre-crisis levels. The colonial administration continued to demand its revenues regardless of the peasants' ability to pay. In many rural areas, indebted peasants faced pressure from moneylenders and landlords despite earning less from crops. The cycle of debt deepened as families borrowed to survive one bad season, only to find themselves even deeper in debt when the next season proved no better. Rice exports remained important, but the value per ton fell, limiting benefits for producers even when export volumes were maintained. In northern and central Vietnam, recurrent floods and droughts around 1930 and 1931 compounded the economic difficulties created by price collapse. The land itself seemed to conspire against those who worked it. Nay, An, and Ha Tin, already land-scarce provinces, were particularly vulnerable to falling rice prices and tax burdens. Contemporary observers linked the Etienne uprisings in 1930 and 1931 to this combination of ecological stress, falling prices, and fiscal pressure. The desperation that drove peasants into the streets was not merely political, but profoundly material, rooted in the simple struggle to survive. In Cochin, smallholder and tenant rice farmers also suffered as the market value of paddy grains declined while production costs remained stubbornly fixed. Some small producers responded by cutting back on hired labor or selling assets, including draft animals, to meet tax and debt obligations. The water buffalo that had been a family's most valuable possession might be sold to pay the landlord, leaving the family with no means to plow their fields in the following season. The crisis encouraged internal migration as land-poor peasants sought work on plantations, in mines, or in cities where they hoped conditions might be better. In mining areas such as Han Gai and coal zones of Tonkin, employers responded to falling coal demand with layoffs and wage reductions. Workers' real wages declined as wage cuts were not fully offset by lower food prices, especially in urban centers where living costs remained relatively high. The early 1930s saw a rise in strikes among industrial and plantation workers, often over wage reductions, extended hours, and layoffs. The patience that had characterized labor relations in better times gave way to open confrontation as workers found themselves with nothing left to lose. Strikes in Nambo in 1930 and 1931, including on plantations and in river transport, were closely linked to deteriorating economic conditions. Workers who had accepted difficult conditions when times were good found those same conditions intolerable when combined with pay cuts and the threat of dismissal. The picket lines that formed outside factories and plantations represented something new in Vietnamese society, a collective assertion of rights that challenged the assumptions of colonial authority. Communist organizers used the crisis to frame economic struggles as part of a broader confrontation with colonial capitalism. They found ready audiences among workers and peasants who were learning through bitter experience that the colonial system would not protect them when times grew hard. The ICP's early program explicitly cited falling prices, heavy taxes, and unemployment as evidence that colonial rule could not secure livelihoods for the Vietnamese people. The spread of Soviet-type structures in Inge Tin in 1930 and 1931 reflected attempts by peasants and workers to manage scarcity and taxation collectively, taking matters into their own hands when no one else would help them. Demonstrators in Ie Chin demanded tax reductions, rent cuts, and the return of communal land taken by landlords, linking local grievances to the wider crisis that affected all of colonial society. French colonial administrators initially treated the downturn as temporary and focused on balancing budgets by maintaining or increasing indirect taxes. State monopolies on salt, alcohol, and opium remained important revenue sources, shifting a larger share of the fiscal burden onto consumers during the Depression. The poor paid for the crisis that they had done nothing to cause. Some limited relief measures were introduced, including public works projects and small reductions or deferments of certain local taxes in heavily affected districts. However, historians generally agree that these relief efforts were modest relative to the scale of rural distress. The crisis weakened many middle-stratum Vietnamese, including small merchants, civil servants, and clerks, who faced salary cuts or job loss. These affected groups formed a receptive audience for both nationalist and communist appeals promising economic reform and political change. The VNQDD's turn toward armed action around 1929 and 1930 occurred against a backdrop of economic contraction and heightened social tension. After the repression of VNQDD in 1930 and 1931, the ICP became the main organized force capable of channeling economic grievances into political movements. The Great Depression reinforced the ICP's emphasis on alliances between workers and poor peasants as the core of revolutionary strategy. In its propaganda, the ICP portrayed plantation capitalists, foreign trading firms, and large landlords as beneficiaries of an economic order that imposed crisis costs on the majority. The colonial administration, concerned about order, strengthened security forces and extended emergency powers during the peak years of unrest. Economic insecurity also contributed to increased informal economic activities, including petty trade and household production, as households sought to diversify income in any way they could. Some French and Vietnamese reform-minded elites debated proposals for land reform, rural credit, and industrial diversification, but few structural changes were implemented before 1936. The conversations produced much discussion but little action. Economic writings of the period, including essays by Vietnamese intellectuals, criticized dependence on a narrow set of export commodities that left the colonial economy vulnerable to price swings in distant markets. The Depression experience convinced many activists that colonial policy prioritized metropolitan interests over stabilizing local living standards. By 1934 and 1935, world prices for some commodities began to recover, easing certain pressures but leaving enduring patterns of rural indebtedness and land concentration that would persist for decades. The recovery, such as it was, came too late for many families who had already lost their land and their livelihoods to the crisis years. The legacy of the Great Depression shaped subsequent political developments, feeding into the Popular Front era and later mobilizations in the late 1930s. Later historians view the 1929 to 1935 crisis as a crucial period in which economic shocks and colonial responses accelerated the politicization of broad segments of Vietnamese society. The Depression had exposed the fragility of the colonial economic system and the unwillingness or inability of French administrators to protect the Vietnamese population from its worst effects. Many Vietnamese had learned during these hard years that they could expect nothing from the colonial state when times grew difficult, and that lesson would shape their political choices for years to come. The economic suffering of the early 1930s became part of the collective memory of a generation, a shared experience that bound together people from different regions and backgrounds in a common understanding of what colonialism truly meant for those at the bottom of its hierarchy. In May and June of 1936, a Popular Front government led by Léon Blum came to power in France, supported in parliament by the French Communist Party. The electoral victory of the left in metropolitan France sent ripples across the colonial empire, including to distant Indochina, where Vietnamese activists watched developments with cautious hope. The Popular Front program included colonial planks promising amnesty for political prisoners, an end to some forms of forced labor, and reductions in excessive taxation. These commitments raised expectations among Vietnamese activists that limited political liberalization and social reform might occur in Indochina. Under ministerial directives from Paris, colonial authorities in Indochina released large numbers of political prisoners in 1936. The prison gates that had remained firmly closed for years suddenly swung open. Approximately 600 political prisoners were freed from Pulo Condor alone during the initial Popular Front amnesty measures. Many released prisoners, hardened by years of detention, re-entered political life with increased prestige and organizational experience gained in the revolutionary universities that the French prisons had inadvertently become. The Popular Front government instructed colonial administrations to relax certain press censorship rules, allowing more Vietnamese language publications to appear than had been possible in years. In Cochinchina, which already had a slightly more liberal legal framework than the protectorates, activists took particular advantage of these loosened controls. Newspapers proliferated, and debates that had been whispered in private could now be conducted more openly. The Indo-Chinese Communist Party, following the 7th Comintern Congress line, shifted in 1936 toward a Popular Front strategy emphasizing broad democratic alliances rather than revolutionary confrontation. Ho Chi Minh from abroad sent guidance to the ICP leadership advocating creation of an Indo-Chinese Democratic Front to unite anti-fascist and anti-reactionary forces. In 1936 and 1937, the ICP temporarily downplayed slogans such as overthrow French imperialism and confiscate landlords' land, prioritizing demands for democratic rights and improved living standards that could unite a broader coalition. Under this line, the ICP sought cooperation with non-communist groups, including bourgeois reformers and some strata of the landlord class, against colonial reaction and fascism. The ICP helped initiate the Indo-Chinese Democratic Front, a broad coalition intended to mobilize petitions and mass meetings in support of Popular Front reforms. One major campaign was the movement for an Indo-Chinese Congress, envisioned as a representative body to present colonial grievances to the Popular Front government in Paris. Action committees were formed in many localities to collect petitions, organize meetings, and select delegates for the projected Indo-Chinese Congress. These action committees often included ICP activists, non-communist nationalists, and moderate reformists cooperating on specific demands despite their differences on ultimate goals. Petitions gathered in this period frequently called for the release of remaining political prisoners, abolition or reduction of forced labor, and greater civil liberties. Other common petition demands included cuts in heavy taxes, higher wages, and recognition of workers' rights to organize. In response to pressure from both metropolitan and colonial opinion, the Indochina administration introduced some labor reforms, including limited recognition of workers' rights and modest improvements in working conditions. The Popular Front climate facilitated a significant wave of strikes in 1936, especially in Cochincina's plantations, factories, and transport sectors. These strikes often combined economic grievances about wages and hours with political slogans referencing Popular Front promises and democratic rights. In Saigon, left-wing activists revived and expanded the newspaper La Lutte, meaning The Struggle, a united front paper involving both ICP members and Trotskyists who set aside their differences to pursue common goals. La Lutte campaigned for amnesty for political prisoners and reported extensively on prison conditions and prisoners' protests. In the 1933 Cochinchina Council elections, before the full Popular Front era, La Lutte's workers' list had already demonstrated the potential of legal electoral activity. After 1936, La Lutte and similar newspapers used the new opening to publicize workers' demands and criticize colonial authorities within legal limits. Trotskyist currents in Saigon criticized the Popular Front government more sharply than the ICP, arguing that it failed to deliver substantive colonial reforms despite its rhetoric. The French Communist Party, aligned with the Popular Front, generally defended a more cautious approach, influencing ICP tactics through Comintern channels. In Cochinchina, legal and semi-legal unions expanded, organizing workers in sectors such as tramways, the arsenal, and rubber plantations. Marxist study groups among students and workers in Saigon, some linked to La Lutte, emerged in 1936 but were banned by authorities in 1937 as the limits of tolerance became clearer. In the protectorates of Tonkin and Annam, where legal space was narrower, Popular Front-era openings still enabled increased circulation of newspapers and petitions, though under tighter scrutiny than in the South. French settlers and some Vietnamese moderates launched reformist newspapers such as L'Effort Indochinois, which advocated autonomy and institutional reform within the French Union. L'Effort Indochinois argued that political and social reforms were essential to stabilize Indochina and respond to growing external threats from an increasingly aggressive Japan. The Indo-Chinese Democratic Front organized public meetings, lectures, and cultural events that discussed democracy, anti-fascism, and social issues with an openness that had been impossible just months before. Under Popular Front influence, the colonial administration reduced some forms of forced labor, the corvée, although many indirect coercive mechanisms persisted. The Sûreté and other security organs remained active, but their methods were somewhat moderated in 1936 and 1937 by political directives from Paris. Nevertheless, colonial police carefully monitored ICP cadres and other radicals, compiling detailed dossiers even as some activities were tolerated. The Indo-Chinese Congress movement, initially tolerated, was shut down by authorities in September 1936, and some organizers were rearrested. This closure signaled limits to the Popular Front's willingness or ability to permit a representative body for Indo-Chinese demands. In 1937, as the Popular Front weakened in France, colonial authorities in Indochina reasserted stricter controls over public meetings and press. The ICP responded by maintaining its legal fronts where possible, but also preserving clandestine structures in anticipation of renewed repression. In May 1937, the ICP launched its own legal newspaper, L'Avant-Garde, meaning the vanguard, in Cochinchina to promote its line and counter Trotskyist influence. L'Avant-Garde criticized Trotskyist positions and defended the Popular Front's strategy of broad alliances and staged demands. By mid-1937, the cooperation between ICP members and Trotskyists inside La Lutte broke down, leading to a split and to more open polemics between the two factions. In April 1939, a Trotskyist-led workers' and peasants' slate associated with La Lutte scored electoral success in Cochinchina council elections, defeating both constitutionalists and the ICP-backed Democratic Front list. This electoral result highlighted the complexity of left politics in southern Vietnam during the late Popular Front period. Many Vietnamese nationalists outside the communist and Trotskyist movements judged that Popular Front reforms fell short of meaningful autonomy or self-government. Some moderate constitutionalist politicians used the opening to press for expanded representation and legal reforms while remaining cautious about mass mobilization that might invite repression. In France, the Popular Front government began to unravel in 1937 and 1938 under economic and political pressure, reducing its capacity to pursue colonial reform. As European tensions escalated, French authorities in Indochina placed increasing emphasis on security and military preparedness rather than further liberalization. On August 23, 1939, the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact triggered a sharp shift in French policy toward communist parties, including the ICP. Shortly afterward, the French Communist Party was outlawed, and the ICP, which had operated semi-legally under Popular Front auspices, was again driven fully underground. The newspapers were shut down, the meetings dispersed, and the activists once again forced into the shadows. The end of the Popular Front era thus closed the brief phase of limited openness in Vietnam and ushered in renewed colonial repression on the eve of World War II. The breathing space had been brief, but it had allowed the movement to rebuild its strength for the struggles ahead. Hundreds of activists had been released from prison and had gained new experience in legal organizing. New members had been recruited, new networks established, and new connections forged. When the repression returned, the movement was better prepared to survive it than it had been in 1931. The war that had consumed Europe since September 1939 sent tremors across every corner of the French Empire. When Germany invaded Poland and the conflict began in earnest, the Daladier government in Paris moved swiftly to tighten security throughout its colonial possessions. In Indochina, this meant renewed vigilance against any force that might exploit wartime uncertainty. The brief opening of the Popular Front years closed with sudden finality. On the 26th of September 1939, a French decree dissolved all organizations linked to the Communist International. In Indochina, this meant the formal banning of the Indochinese Communist Party. Colonial police and sûreté units intensified their operations, arresting suspected communists and shutting down the legal and semi-legal front organizations that had operated during the previous years of relative tolerance. Newspapers associated with the ICP and other left currents found themselves closed or placed under strict censorship. The crackdown disrupted ICP organizational structures across the colony. Regional committees were broken up, Leaders were arrested or forced into deeper clandestinity than they had known since the worst years of the early decade. Then came the catastrophe in Europe that changed everything. In June 1940, France signed an armistice with Germany, creating the Vichy regime. This collaborationist government retained nominal authority over French Indochina, and a new governor-general arrived to manage the colony under these strange new circumstances. Jean Decoux would govern Indochina through years of compromise and constraint, attempting to preserve French authority while accommodating a new and far more dangerous presence. Japan had been at war with China since 1937, and its military planners viewed Indochina with strategic hunger. The colony sat astride supply routes that fed Chinese resistance. Its rice paddies could provision armies. Its ports and airfields could project power across Southeast Asia. As early as June 1940, Japanese diplomats began pressing Vichy authorities for military access and basing rights. France, defeated and occupied in Europe, was in no position to refuse. On the 22nd of September 1940, Vichy France and Japan concluded an agreement that allowed Japanese troops to be stationed in northern Indochina and to use 3 airfields. The agreement formally limited the Japanese garrison to 6,000 stationed troops and up to 25,000 in transit, though these limits were soon exceeded in practice. Japanese forces crossed the border into Tonkin in late September, occupying key positions while French colonial authorities remained in place. A strange new order had begun. A second major agreement in December 1940 confirmed that French civil and military authorities would continue to administer Indochina while Japan would enjoy extensive basing rights. Further accords in January and May 1941 expanded Japanese privileges, including economic cooperation and security guarantees along the border with Thailand. By 1941, approximately 40,000 Japanese troops were stationed in Indochina, with garrisons in both northern and southern Vietnam. The arrangement that emerged was neither straightforward occupation nor genuine alliance. Indochina remained formally under French sovereignty, but existed effectively under dual French-Japanese control. Governor-General Decoux sought to maintain French authority by cooperating with Japanese demands while reinforcing colonial discipline over the Vietnamese population. Vichy authorities launched propaganda emphasizing what they called Franco-Indochinese solidarity, hoping to secure local support under the constraints imposed by Tokyo. Japanese authorities maintained their own intelligence networks and liaison offices in major Vietnamese cities, operating alongside the French Sûreté and military intelligence. Both French and Japanese security organs monitored Vietnamese political movements, sometimes sharing information to suppress perceived threats. The Vietnamese population found itself caught between two masters, each suspicious of the other, both determined to prevent any challenge to their authority. In September 1940, amid the Japanese advance and French weakness, a local uprising occurred around Bac Son in northern Vietnam. Elements linked to the ICP participated in this brief rebellion, which combined local grievances with broader hopes that the colonial order might be crumbling. Combined French and Japanese forces suppressed the Bac Son uprising, but the experience encouraged ICP strategists to consider guerrilla tactics in mountainous border areas where central authority was weak. In November 1940, another uprising broke out in Cochinchina, partly initiated by ICP cadres hoping to exploit the apparent confusion of the moment. Colonial forces suppressed this rebellion as well. After these uprisings, repression intensified. Many communists and perceived sympathizers were arrested, imprisoned, or executed, further weakening the already battered ICP leadership. The party would need years to rebuild from these losses. Japanese strategic priorities in Indochina centered on securing railways, ports, and airfields to support operations in China and later throughout Southeast Asia. From 1941 onward, Japan obtained most favored nation status in Indochina's trade, enabling it to dominate imports and exports. A 1941 agreement committed the French administration to export 700,000 tons of rice and 15,000 tons of rubber to Japan annually. Vietnam became a major supplier of rice to the Japanese war machine. In 1942, Vietnam provided roughly 37% of Japanese rice imports. By 1943, that figure had risen to approximately 58%. To meet these extraordinary demands, French authorities prioritized rice deliveries to Japanese buyers and transport under Japanese control. Farmers were required to deliver quotas of rice to official collection points or authorized brokers, often at fixed prices set below prevailing market levels. Japanese and French authorities coordinated to control both the supply and price of rice, with interventions reaching down to village, district, and provincial levels. Large volumes of rubber, coal, and other resources from Vietnam were also directed to Japanese war industries. The occupation regime used complex payment mechanisms, including clearing arrangements and occupation currency, to finance Japanese purchases and the costs of maintaining troops in the colony. Japanese military units stationed themselves near key infrastructure throughout the country. Ports like Haiphong and Saigon saw regular Japanese presence. Airfields across Tonkin, Annam, and Cochinchina hosted Japanese aircraft. French colonial troops remained responsible for day-to-day policing and administration, but they operated under constraints imposed by Japanese military authorities. French administrators continued to enforce colonial laws, including censorship, forced labor provisions, and restrictions on political association. Wartime conditions contributed to inflation throughout Indochina. Prices of many basic goods rose significantly in Vietnamese markets during the early 1940s, squeezing urban wage earners and rural producers whose incomes did not keep pace with the rising cost of living. Fuel and manufactured goods became scarcer as Allied navies disrupted sea routes and Japanese priorities diverted supplies away from civilian consumption. The presence of Japanese troops generated additional local demands for housing, food, and services in cities such as Hanoi, Hue, and Saigon. Vietnamese civilians encountered dual signs of authority everywhere they looked. French tricolors and Japanese rising sun flags flew from official buildings and military installations. Japanese propaganda promoted concepts of a Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, claiming to support Asian liberation from Western colonialism. French propaganda, by contrast, stressed continuity of French civilizing and protective roles, seeking to minimize Japanese ideological influence among Vietnamese. Neither message rang entirely true to populations who experienced the reality of dual exploitation. The complex arrangement created both opportunities and risks for Vietnamese political movements, which had to navigate carefully between French and Japanese administrations. The ICP, weakened by earlier repression, gradually began rebuilding underground networks in remote areas, notably in Cao Bang and other northern border provinces where neither French nor Japanese authority reached effectively. In 1941, Ho Chi Minh returned to Vietnam via southern China and advocated creation of a broad national front against both French colonialism and Japanese militarism. During 1942 through 1944, guerrilla bands and self-defense units in northern uplands harassed local colonial authorities and Japanese outposts on a limited scale. Both French and Japanese forces responded to such activities with sweeps and arrests, increasing security operations in areas with known resistance presence. As the Pacific War turned against Japan after 1943, Japanese authorities tightened economic controls and requisitions in Indochina to sustain their war effort. By early 1945, relations between French and Japanese authorities had deteriorated sharply. Tokyo suspected that French officials might cooperate with an Allied landing. The tensions that had simmered beneath dual rule were approaching a breaking point. The strange compromise that had governed Indochina since 1940 could not hold forever. Change was coming, though few could predict what form it would take. In February 1941, after nearly 3 decades abroad, Nguyen Ai Quoc returned to the land of his birth. He crossed the border from China into Cao Bang province and established a base at a place called Pac Ba, a remote limestone cave area near the frontier. The man who would soon be known to the world as Ho Chi Minh had come home to lead a revolution. From the 10th to the 19th of May 1941, the 8th plenum of the Indo-Chinese Communist Party Central Committee met at Pac Bo under his chairmanship. The gathering made decisions that would shape Vietnamese history for decades to come. The plenum determined that the immediate central task was national independence. Anti-imperialist struggle would take priority over class issues. The time had come to create a broad national front that could unite different strata of Vietnamese society against French colonialism and Japanese militarism. On the 19th of May 1941 at Pac Bo, the delegates formally founded the Viet Nam Dup Lup Dong Minh Hoi, the League for the Independence of Vietnam. This organization would become known simply as the Viet Minh. It was conceived as a communist-led but formally multi-class front, open to workers, peasants, intellectuals, small traders, and even patriotic landlords who shared the goal of national liberation. Its stated purpose was straightforward yet revolutionary: to achieve complete independence for Vietnam from foreign domination. A formal Viet Minh declaration and program issued in October 1941 outlined the movement's aims. The program called for the overthrow of French colonial rule, the expulsion of Japanese forces, and the establishment of a democratic republic. It promised reduction of rents and interest rates, abolition of heavy taxes, and distribution of land to those who tilled it. These were practical promises designed to appeal to the masses while avoiding the more radical socialist measures that might alienate potential allies. Nguyen Ai Quoc designed the Viet Minh as an umbrella organization under which the ICP could operate clandestinely while reaching far beyond its own membership. The front established affiliated mass organizations known as National Salvation Associations for workers, peasants, youth, women, and soldiers. These associations served as recruitment and political education channels, bringing non-party activists into structured activity under Viet Minh influence. Cao Bang Province was chosen as the primary base area for sound strategic reasons. Its rugged terrain made it difficult for colonial forces to penetrate. Existing revolutionary networks from earlier organizing efforts provided a foundation, and its proximity to China offered both refuge and the possibility of external support. By 1942 and 1943, Viet Minh influence had spread across much of the Viet Bắc upland region, including parts of Sao Bang, Bắc Cang, Lang Son, Thai Nguyen, Tuyen Quang, and Ha Giang. The ICP Interprovincial Committee for Cao Bang, Bắc Cang, and Lang Son directed early Viet Minh organizational work in this northern frontier zone. Nguyen Ai Quoc oversaw the creation of routes linking Sao Bang to other Viet Bắc provinces and eventually to lowland areas. By 1943, 19 teams had been formed to carry documents, establish contacts, and set up cells along these pathways. The revolution was spreading, slowly but deliberately. Viet Minh recruitment in the base areas relied on small study groups where cadres explained national liberation goals and basic political ideas. Political education stressed that the immediate enemy was foreign imperialism and Japanese militarism, while contradictions within Vietnamese society were to be handled carefully and patiently. The Viet Minh published a small newspaper called Vietnam Doc Lup from Pac Ba starting in 1941. Each issue was only 2 to 4 pages, but these sheets carried enormous significance. Hand-copied or mimeographed versions were circulated in remote villages, often read aloud by literate activists to listeners who had never learned to read. The Eighth Plenum had decided to organize armed forces as what were called armed propaganda units. Their main tasks were agitation, protection of cadres, and limited military actions rather than conventional warfare. Vo Nguyen Giap, an ICP cadre who would later become one of the 20th century's most celebrated military commanders, played a key role in building these early Viet Minh armed units in the Cao Bang region. In 1941 and 1942, small guerrilla groups operated in Cao Bang and neighboring provinces. They focused on self-defense, securing food supplies, and distributing leaflets. They used hit-and-run tactics and avoided direct, large engagements, following the ICP strategy of prolonged People's War. The goal was not immediate military victory, but gradual expansion of influence and capability. The Viet Minh's base area administration established rudimentary systems of local governance. People's committees handled taxation, security, and dispute mediation. These committees coordinated rice collection for cadres, organized local self-defense groups, and implemented Viet Minh decrees on rents and labor obligations. Viet Minh policy in base areas emphasized respectful behavior toward villagers to secure cooperation and distinguish its forces from the bandit groups that roamed the highlands. In August 1942, Nguyen Ai Quoc crossed into Guangxi, China, as a representative of what he called Independent Allied Vietnam, seeking contact with Chinese and Allied authorities. Chinese nationalist authorities arrested him, leading to more than a year of detention before his release in 1943. During his absence, ICP leaders such as Trung Chin and Pham Van Dom oversaw Viet Minh expansion inside Vietnam. The movement continued to grow even without its founder present. The ICP adopted resolutions in 1943, further elaborating the Viet Minh's political line, including efforts to attract intellectuals, religious figures, and small property owners to the cause. In 1944, as the war's balance shifted against Japan, Viet Minh armed forces expanded and undertook more frequent attacks on small outposts, patrols, and supply lines. On the 22nd of December 1944, near Cao Bang, the Viet Minh formally established the Vietnam Propaganda and Liberation Army Team with an initial force of about 34 fighters. This small unit conducted early actions against small French posts, both to secure weapons and to demonstrate its presence to local populations. These were modest beginnings for what would become a formidable military force. Viet Minh appeals emphasized cooperation between Kinh, the ethnic Vietnamese majority, and minority groups in the Viet Bắc region, including Thai and Nung communities. To expand support, cadres participated in village festivals, assisted with harvests, and used local languages where possible. The movement created youth and women's associations within base areas, organizing literacy classes, mutual aid, and support for guerrilla fighters. Throughout 1943 and 1944, Viet Minh influence gradually extended from upland bases toward lowland districts in Thanh Nguyen and Bắc Giang. By 1944 and into 1945, the Viet Minh had established more permanent liberated zones in parts of Viet Bắc where French authority was minimal and Japanese presence limited. As Japan tightened its control over Indochina, the Viet Minh increasingly framed its struggle as directed against both Japanese and French authorities. In mid-1944, the United States Office of Strategic Services began exploring contacts with anti-Japanese groups in Indochina for intelligence and rescue operations. OAS officers eventually established contact with Ho Chi Minh in 1945. The Viet Minh cooperated with OSS teams in training and assisting guerrillas, as well as in rescuing downed Allied airmen in northern Vietnam. This cooperation included limited supplies of arms, radios, and medical support to selected Viet Minh units operating against Japanese targets. Viet Minh propaganda portrayed the organization as part of the global anti-fascist front, aligning itself rhetorically with Allied efforts against Japan. Relations with other Vietnamese groups remained complex. The Viet Minh sought alliances but also competed with rival nationalist organizations for influence. Some non-communist figures joined or cooperated with the front, viewing it as the most effective anti-Japanese and anti-French force. Others, including certain royalists and conservative nationalists, remained wary of the communist leadership. By late 1944 and early 1945, Viet Minh local committees were operating in many villages of the Viet Bắc region, collecting information, coordinating supplies, and preparing for wider uprisings. The leadership monitored international developments, including Soviet advances and Allied gains in the Pacific, to judge the timing of larger actions. On the 9th of March, 1945, when Japanese forces launched their coup against French authorities, the sudden power vacuum created opportunities the Viet Minh moved quickly to exploit. In the months following, Viet Minh forces expanded operations, seized weapons from disarmed French units, and intensified efforts to establish local committees in lowland and urban areas. By August 1945, on the eve of Japan's surrender, the Viet Minh had built an extensive network capable of initiating a nationwide insurrection. The Vietnamese famine of 1944 and 1945 reached its terrible peak in northern Vietnam during roughly March and April of 1945, as Japanese occupation and French administration together presided over catastrophe. Modern research estimates famine deaths in Tonkin and northern Annam between approximately 400,000 and 2 million people, with many studies clustering around 1 to 1.3 million. The disaster affected around 32 provinces across Colonial Tonkin and Annam, substantially reducing the population of what is now northern and parts of central Vietnam. Contributing factors included poor harvests in 1944 due to adverse weather conditions, including typhoons and flooding in the Red River Delta. Japanese and French authorities had promoted increased cultivation of industrial crops such as jute and cotton in some areas, reducing land available for rice. Wartime rice requisitions for Japanese troops and exports to Japan further reduced the quantity of rice available for local consumption. Allied bombing and blockade disrupted coastal shipping, making it difficult to move surplus rice from Cochin China in the south to the deficit northern regions. Colonial and Japanese controls on rice markets, including price regulations and compulsory sales, complicated local access to grain during the crisis. French and Japanese authorities both later faced criticism from Vietnamese sources for failing to organize effective emergency redistribution of food. The Viet Minh used the famine to denounce both French colonialism and Japanese militarism, arguing that foreign exploitation had contributed to the catastrophe. Viet Minh cadres in some affected areas organized rice seizures from warehouses and encouraged local redistribution to starving populations. These relief activities and famine propaganda helped expand Viet Minh's support among rural populations. While the famine was unfolding, Japanese and French political relations in Indochina deteriorated as Tokyo feared French collaboration with the Allies. After the liberation of France in 1944 and de Gaulle's rise to power, Tokyo suspected that French authorities in Indochina might support an Allied landing. On the evening of the 9th of March 1945, Japanese Ambassador Matsumoto delivered an ultimatum to Governor-General Jean Decoux demanding that French military and police forces be placed under Japanese command. Decoux resisted full compliance, leading Japanese Commander General Tsuchihashi to interpret the response as rejection and to order a coup de force that same night. Japanese forces launched coordinated attacks on French garrisons in major centers including Hanoi, Saigon, Haiphong, Hue, and Nha Trang. In some locations, French colonial troops and the Garde Indochinoise resisted briefly, but most garrisons were overwhelmed within hours or days. By mid-March, organized French military resistance in Indochina had largely collapsed, with surviving units retreating toward China or into remote areas. Following the coup, Tokyo abolished French military authority but retained much of the French civil administration at lower levels where useful. On the 11th of March 1945, Emperor Bao Dait, under Japanese auspices, issued a proclamation annulling the 1884 protectorate treaties with France. Japan encouraged Bao Dai to declare the independence of the Empire of Vietnam, which was recognized by Tokyo but lacked substantial independent power. The imperial government established in Hue depended heavily on Japanese military protection and administrative guidance. The Viet Minh viewed the Japanese coup as confirmation that French rule had been weakened and that a new political opening was emerging. After the 9th of March, Viet Minh units intensified efforts to disarm isolated French detachments and acquire weapons abandoned during retreats. The famine, Japanese coup, and collapse of French power together created a sharp political and social crisis in northern and central Vietnam. On the 19th of May 1945, a Viet Minh organized national convention was convened at Ten Trao, north of Hanoi, with delegates from various regions. The convention placed national independence at the center of its agenda and appointed Ho Chi Minh head of the National Liberation Committee. In late July and early August, news of Allied advances and impending Japanese defeat reached Viet Minh leadership in Viet Bắc. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima on the 6th of August and Nagasaki on the 9th, followed by Soviet entry into the war against Japan on the 8th of August, accelerated Tokyo's decision to surrender. On the 13th of August 1945, the Viet Minh leadership issued a general insurrection order calling for widespread uprising before Allied forces arrived. A national uprising committee was formed to coordinate actions across different regions of Vietnam. On the 16th and 17th of August, a national congress convened again at Ten Trao, endorsing the insurrection plan and confirming the National Liberation Committee as a provisional government. Starting mid-August, Viet Minh committees and Allied forces took control of many district towns and rural areas in northern Vietnam, often facing limited resistance. In Hanoi, mass demonstrations organized by the Viet Minh began on the 17th and 18th of August, drawing large crowds into the streets. On the 19th of August, Viet Minh forces occupied key administrative buildings in Hanoi, including the office of the resident superior and police headquarters. The Hanoi Municipal Revolutionary Committee announced that it had taken power in the city in the name of the Viet Minh and the people. In Hue, the imperial capital, demonstrations and Viet Minh pressure led to a shift of power on the 23rd of August. Emperor Bao Dai agreed to abdicate, and on the 25th of August he formally handed over the imperial seal and sword to Viet Minh representatives. Following abdication, Bao Dai accepted a position as supreme advisor to the new government. In Saigon, Viet Minh and other nationalist forces organized demonstrations from mid-August. On the 25th of August, they seized many key buildings in the city. Power transfers in southern Vietnam were more contested, involving various armed groups, but the Viet Minh nonetheless proclaimed authority there. By the end of August, Viet Minh committees or Allied Revolutionary Committees claimed control over most provincial capitals in northern and central Vietnam. On the 28th of August 1945, the Provisional Government of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam was announced with Ho Chi Minh as president. Preparations began for a public declaration of independence in Hanoi to consolidate Viet Minh authority and signal the creation of a new state. On the 2nd of September 1945, Ho Chi Minh read the Declaration of Independence of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam at Ba Dinh Square in Hanoi. The ceremony was attended by a large crowd of Vietnamese from Hanoi and surrounding areas, along with representatives of the Viet Minh leadership. The declaration opened by citing key phrases from the 1776 United States Declaration of Independence and the 1789 French Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. It asserted that all peoples have the right to life, liberty, and happiness, and applied this principle to the Vietnamese nation. The document reviewed French colonial rule, accusing it of political oppression and economic exploitation, and noted the severe conditions of the recent famine. It argued that France had failed to protect Vietnam when Japan occupied the country, thereby forfeiting its claims to sovereignty. The declaration affirmed that Vietnam had the right to be a free and independent country, and proclaimed that fact to the world. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam was thus proclaimed as a new state, replacing both French colonial administration and the short-lived Japanese-backed Empire of Vietnam. At the time of proclamation, no major Allied power formally recognized the new republic, and the Allies continued to recognize French sovereignty over Indochina. In the weeks after the 2nd of September, the government moved to establish ministries, issue decrees, and create local people's committees throughout northern and parts of central Vietnam. The August Revolution and the establishment of the Democratic Republic occurred in a context of impending Allied occupation and French plans to restore control. The struggles that would follow lay ahead. But for this moment, a new chapter in Vietnamese history had begun. The years from Versailles to this declaration had witnessed the transformation of scattered nationalist aspirations into a disciplined movement capable of seizing power in a moment of imperial collapse. What had begun with petitions submitted to an international conference had ended with revolution. The young man who had once called himself Nguyen Ai Quoc, presenting his 8-point claims to indifferent delegates in Paris, now stood before his people as president of an independent republic. The path from 1919 to 1945 had wound through French socialist meetings and Comintern congresses, through training schools and prisons. It passed through the failed uprising at Yên Bai and the suppressed Soviets of Nha Kinh, through underground struggle and the Popular Front opening. It traversed the dual occupation of the war years and the horror of famine that claimed 1 million lives. All of these experiences had shaped the movement that now claimed power. From the ashes of colonialism, a nation had declared itself reborn.